I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here, and it was really an honor to be invited to have a chapter in Drugging Our Children, how profiteers are pushing antipsychotics on our youngest, and what we can do to stop it. I'm going to be talking today about drugging our children, legal and moral issues. I'm with the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, known as Psych Rights. We're a public interest law firm whose mission is to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock around the country. I was just talking to someone yesterday, I think he said, oh, is electroshock still being done in this country? And not only is electroshock still being done in this country, it's being forced on thousands of people every year. But in any event, we adopted this massive drugging of children and youth as a priority a few years ago because, as bad as it is with adults, it's just even more abhorrent what is going on with children. So this book, and I'm going to, the next few minutes I'm going to talk about some statistics, and they come primarily from this book, Drugging Our Children, the first chapter, especially by Robert Whitaker, and he's got another terrific book called Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America. And these statistics come from there. And also, I recommend the book, Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry by Dr. Breggin, who's here. Dr. Breggin is really probably the pioneer in research in this area, 20, 25 years ago, especially his seminal book, Toxic Psychiatry, really is the first book that I know of that put together this research about essentially how we were being told lies about the efficacy and safety of psychiatric drugs and electroshock for that matter. Okay, so I'm going to talk not just about the neuroleptics, but also about this pathway from other drugs that are causing people to get put on the neuroleptics. And I call the drugs neuroleptics instead of antipsychotics because antipsychotic is really just is marketing hype. They don't have much antipsychotic properties. What they do is basically suppress people so much that they can't create problems for the other people in their lives. Now, for some people, maybe they knock down the voices a little bit, but mostly what they do is just make people so apathetic that they don't care or don't react to whatever the problems are in their lives that are then causing the behavior issues that are making things difficult for them and causing problems from those around them. So one of these drugs that started, I don't know, in the 70s it really took off was this idea that boys being boys have a disease called attention deficit disorder that then became attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And they were prescribing the ubiquitous prescription of stimulants, ADHD medications. The most commonly known, I think, is Ritalin, methylphenidate, and then now we've got new drugs on patent, Strattera and Adderall. They're all stimulants. And so they have certain adverse effects. So in the physical realm, they cause drowsiness, appetite loss, lethargy, insomnia, headaches, abdominal pain, motor abnormalities, tics, jaw clenching, skin problems, liver disorders, weight loss, growth suppression, hypertension, and sudden cardiac death. Death is a side effect from, well, I wouldn't even call it a side effect. I think these are adverse effects. But these drugs, the stimulants, are causing 18-year-olds to drop dead. I kid you not. In fact, I was speaking with someone, maybe a month ago now, and he said he had a friend who was on them, and he was in his mid-20s, early 20s, and he just dropped dead. And so I think you really have, he was a very athletic person. I think you just have to really suspect the stimulants. They cause emotional problems. depression, apathy, a general dullness, mood swings, crying jacks, irritability, anxiety, and a sense of hostility from the world. And then they also cause psychiatric symptoms, obsessive compulsive symptoms, mania, paranoia, psychotic episodes, and hallucinations. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But these psychiatric effects of these drugs then become a pathway to get diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And the same thing is true of what's called the SSRI antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Their physical effects include insomnia. Well, anybody that doesn't sleep long enough is going to become psychotic. It's happened to me. Sexual dysfunction, headaches, gastrointestinal problems, dizziness, tremors, nervousness, muscle cramps, muscle weakness, seizures, and akathisia associated with increased risk of suicide. Does everybody here know what akathisia is? Well, that's this inner restlessness that people can't sit still. They get up and pace and they sit down and they go back and forth and they just, it just literally drives people nuts. It drives people to jump off bridges to get away from it. Another book by Dr. Bregan, Medication Madness, goes through a number of cases of people that really have been driven to extreme acts from these drugs. So the antidepressants, the so-called antidepressants, and I say so-called because the independent studies have shown they basically don't work. That the same number of people get better whether they take the antidepressants or not. But the ones that don't take them, of course, don't get these negative effects. And these antidepressants also cause emotional and psychiatric problems, including psychosis, mania, behavioral toxicity, panic attacks, anxiety, apathy, and emotional dulling. They also double the risk of suicidal acts. And they also increase violence. From all of the school shooters that we know of, it's pretty clear that most, if not all of them, were on these drugs. And when you look at people that do things that are so far out of character, extreme violent acts, whether it's suicide or homicide or other violent act, I think one always needs to look and see whether or not the drugs were a causative factor, especially these so-called antidepressants. Okay, the neuroleptics also have very severe adverse effects. Psychosis being one of them. These drugs were approved for psychosis or schizophrenia, but right on the label, listed as an adverse effect, is psychosis. How many people know what tardive dyskinesia is? Not everybody. Okay, so tardive dyskinesia is a motor disorder caused by the drugs that cause people to, you see people smacking their lips and moving their tongues in it. It's an uncontrollable movement, and it's an indication of damage to the basal ganglia, and it's basically drug-induced Parkinsonism. And in many cases, it does not go away once the drug is removed. It's permanent. The neuroleptics also cause brain shrinkage and cognitive decline, metabolic dysfunction, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hormonal abnormalities, movement disorders, cardiovascular problems, emotional blunting, sedation, and cognitive problems. Adverse events are worse in children and adolescents than in adults, and they also cause early death. So these are the drugs that we're talking about. Now, I do know people, adults, that find the drugs helpful. And I think they maybe ought to be allowed to take them. But I think at the same time, they should be told the truth about them, which they rarely are, including that there are other approaches that have been found to be far more helpful to many people without the adverse effects. Now, for children, I don't think they're ever warranted. For one thing, children they're not the decision makers. It's always someone else that's making the decision for them. And the adverse effects of these drugs simply, I don't think, can be overridden by the supposed benefit, which in fact is very little. Well, in fact, you can't really identify a positive benefit for the child, really, child or youth. What really happens with these drugs is that they are so disabling to the child that they can no longer create problems for the adults, at least short term. So it looks like they're, quote, working, and then oftentimes those behaviors come back, and then they just up the dose and add drugs. Okay, so I talked about the stimulants and antidepressants earlier, and they both are a pathway to bipolar disorder. In a Canadian study, 6% of ADH children treated with stimulants for an average of 21 months developed psychotic symptoms. In a study of 195 bipolar children, Dimitri Papalos found that 65% had hypomanic, manic, and aggressive reactions to stimulant medications. At the University of Cincinnati, they reported that 21 of 34 adolescent patients who were hospitalized for mania had been on stimulants prior to the onset of an affective episode. Okay, so the stimulants are causing children and youth to have bipolar symptoms. Okay, then the antidepressants do the same thing. In the first pediatric trial of Prozac, 6% of the treated children suffered a manic episode, none in the placebo group. At Harvard University, researchers find that 25% of children treated for depression convert to bipolar within 4 years. 25% convert to bipolar within 4 years. And a Washington University research report that within 10 years, 50% of prepubertal children treated for depression convert to bipolar illness. So we've got this massive conversion of children given these other drugs into being diagnosed with bipolar disorder as a result of the drugs. So in summary, what we we see, and what we should be worried about in the use of psychotropics in children and youth is that there's an increased risk of disability, the bipolar pathway. There are all these physical ailments. There's emotional lethargy, cognitive decline, and early death. And this graph shows the huge impact that this has had. Before the neuroleptics started being used, and before, well, as this epidemic has progressed, in 1988 there were virtually no children on supplemental security income disability due to mental illness, SSRI disability. Virtually no children. And now we're almost at 600,000 children that are considered so disabled because of a mental illness that they're on disability. So from 0 to 600,000 in 20 years. Okay, and this is really what I'm here to talk about is, you know, what legal issues arise from this, and I can't really talk about all of them here, and I don't have the time. And I go through some of them in the book, and I encourage you to get it. But the legal issues can be broken down in a few ways. One is, what are the rights of the children themselves? In a nutshell, children in state custody have the right not to be harmed by the state. The state, once they take custody of a child, they have the right not to be harmed. In fact, they have the state has the obligation to properly take care of them, nurture them, provide them emotional support and all that kind of thing, which they basically don't get most of the time. There's also a legal question about what are the rights of children not in state custody not to be harmed by their parents. That's a harder thing probably to sue on. Then there are the rights of parents. And one of the things that happens, and Sharna mentioned this a little bit, is that parents are threatened that their drugs will either be thrown out of school or taken away from them if they're not given psychiatric drugs. And I've seen this happen over and over again, and they are thrown out of school and they are taken away from their parents, and the alleged reason is that the parent or parents are neglecting their child's medical needs by not giving them psychiatric drugs. Okay. Then there's international law. Much of the psychiatric drugging of children really is a violation of international law. I don't have really the time to talk about that. And then another legal issue is, what about off-label prescribing? There's this, in the U.S., basically there's part of the law is that if the FDA approves a drug for any indication, i.e. any diagnosis, the doctor can prescribe it for any other reason. The drug companies cannot legally promote that or market that, but they do it anyway, surreptitiously and through proxies and that sort of thing. But the doctors are allowed legally to prescribe them, but I'll talk a little bit about another way of getting at that. And then, especially of interest, I think, to this group is the authority of psychologists. What authority, legal authority, do psychologists have to try and do something about this situation? Okay, and two areas are diagnosis and truth-telling. One of the concerns that psychologists have about diagnosing, or basically challenging diagnosis of a psychiatrist is, oh, am I going to be charged with the unauthorized practice of law? And basically this is a legal issue that is regulated state by state, and I can't say about every state, but the basic rule is that it's not the unauthorized practice of medicine, it's the authorized practice of psychology. So if, as a psychologist, you're licensed to give a diagnosis, you have every legal authority to do that, even if it's a different diagnosis than a psychiatrist. And I'm going to talk in a little bit. I think that there's an obligation to do that because the diagnosis is often basically the justification for giving a child or youth drugs. And so not only that, the diagnosis itself is a very harmful thing. I mean, basically the idea, it's a very demoralizing thing for the child or youth. It is also a process that really strips the child and youth of any responsibility. It's my ADHD that made me do it, or it's my bipolar that made me do it, and then it becomes not their responsibility. And frankly, it also takes away the responsibility of the parent. And I'm not talking about blame here. I'm talking about responsibility to do things to help the child better regulate their behavior. And then the other authority of psychologists is truth-telling. I think everybody has the right to tell the truth about these drugs. And we had other presentations this morning and this afternoon, and I talked a little bit about some of the harms caused by these drugs. And it's pretty uncommon for prescribing psychiatrists or other doctors to actually go through the adverse events or even accurately tell the patient or parent the true likely benefits of the drugs, because these drugs really have a very poor benefit profile. Okay, so then what might be done about this? And I can't talk about all of them, but and again, you can read the book, Drugging Our Children. One possible remedy is a direct action, a civil rights litigation under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, known as Section 1983. It's a Civil War era statute, or right after the Civil War, where people can sue state officials or people employed or used by the state for violating their civil rights, quote, under color of state law. And what that means basically is that they're using the authority of the state law to do something. And we actually brought a lawsuit under this basic idea in state court in Alaska. It was one of the things. And one of the things, and what we asked for were four things. One is that psychiatric drugs not be given to children unless psychosocial interventions have been exhausted. The person making the decision is fully informed. The rationally determined benefits outweigh the risks, and that there are mechanisms in place to monitor for adverse events and deal with them. And then we got thrown out on a technicality, basically saying we didn't have standing. But we think these are very viable cases to take into federal court, probably have to be done as class actions. I mentioned before about international law, and that's, I think, an intriguing possibility is to bring cases under international law that what we're doing to children and youth is a violation of international law. So you can have federal litigation under federal law, and you can also have state litigation under state law, which would be, the states, when they take control of children in foster care, they will have statutes that basically say you have to nurture them and provide medical care and discipline and those kind of things, and again, not harm them. So those are things that, types of cases that can be brought. There's also an indirect action, which I'm really quite optimistic about, even though we haven't had success to date, which is that Medicaid coverage is limited to what's known as a medically accepted indication, and those are indications approved by the FDA or supported by drug references known as compendia. So people know if an indication, and an indication means the same thing as a diagnosis, if it's not prescribed for an approved indication, that's off-label, and I think everybody knows what off-label means, or a lot of people do. Well, Congress did say we won't pay for all off-label prescribing, but we'll only pay for off-label prescriptions that have scientific support, and together those are called medically accepted indications. Okay, well over half of the psychiatric drugs given to children and youth are not for medically accepted indications, and there's a federal law known as the False Claims Act, which allows people to sue on behalf of the federal government to recover for the fraud and share, if they win, share in the recovery. And each false claim, in this case a prescription, carries a minimum penalty of $5,500. So we have developed a model complaint, and we've got this Medicaid fraud initiative, that it's set up for a former foster youth to sue the psychiatrist and the pharmacy. But anybody with information about specific offending prescriptions can bring these suits, such as psychologists, social workers, parents. Anyway, we have this model complaint. There are lots of technicalities about it. I can't go into it now, but one is that you need an attorney to file these cases. Now, this next graphic basically shows what we have is a fraudulent scheme here, which is the drug companies get the doctors to prescribe these drugs off-label or not for medically accepted indication, and then of course the pharmacies fill them and bill the federal government. And that's a false claim. The federal government has literally gotten billions of dollars against drug companies for causing doctors to make these prescriptions. Zyprexa, Risperdal, Geodon, Seroquel, I'm not sure about Seroquel, and there are ones in the work, and Risperdal. Literally billions of dollars, but they haven't really stopped the practice because the psychiatrists are still doing it, and the pediatricians and other doctors. And it's really just a relatively minor cost of doing business for the drug companies. And our idea is that by getting one or more of these doctors tagged with one of these lawsuits, it essentially would bankrupt any psychiatrist that got tagged with these, because anyone worth his salt would have at least 1,000 prescriptions, and that's $5.5 million. That it would put the brakes on the practice for other doctors. And then we included the pharmacies because the big ones, at least, have deep pockets, and that's something that would interest the lawyers. The really curious thing is that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Medicaid agency, also known as CMS, is refusing to enforce this restriction. And I think there's really a scandal in that. Okay, so that's one thing that people can do. So what are the moral responsibilities of psychologists when faced with this reality? I think there's a moral responsibility to correct wrong diagnoses. There's a moral responsibility to tell the truth, to not go along with when people are drugs are going to help them and not have any negative effects. And I think more than that, that there's an obligation to not accept what's going on at a system-wide level, that everybody needs to speak up and try and make change. And there's an opportunity to do that next month was it next month? Well, May 5th. In Philadelphia, there's a protest, Occupy the American Psychiatric Association. And I really encourage everybody to go, everybody who can go. It's so important that this issue be brought to the mainstream public, and we need to have people really stand up to what's going on. And coming to this protest May 5th in Philadelphia is, I think, a very good way of doing that. And we have free t-shirts, a limited number of free t-shirts that say, well, you can see it there. And I'll give you a little background for this. There was an article in Minneapolis. There was some I think it was some Minnesota researcher who was exposed as having basically signed off on a ghostwritten manuscript about, I think, the benefits of Seroquel. And right at the end of the article, there was this question: was Schultz, and that was this guy's name, Charles Schultz, as it were, was he fooled or was he complicit in publishing this fraudulent data? I think that this really demonstrates the state of psychiatry at this stage. I mean, I try not to ascribe bad motives to people, and I certainly don't do that to most psychiatrists. I think they're trying to help. But at this point, with all this evidence out there about the fraudulent research, the corrupting of the medical journals, this massive amount of harm that's being done, why are they still doing it? I think that's really the question, and we need to put them to that question. And I think we all have responsibility to do what we can. As Arundhati Roy said, the trouble is, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet and saying nothing becomes as political an act as speaking out. There is no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. Thank you.